Okay, so I haven't done one of these for you guys in a while. We already kind of started part of this in class. I just wanted to go through a few things as you're kind of finishing up your presentations. So obviously we talked about the stone wall in this picture. Obviously New England was a huge farming community right after the settlers came, the Pilgrims. Before that it was hunter and gatherers, the Native Americans that lived here. So you'll see this type of structure anywhere all and around New England, whether it be East Bridgewater all the way to Vermont. We talked a little bit about the types of trees that were here and how the genetic diversity has changed over time based on the fact that certain trees were cut down. Once again, we talked about this. Here we go. It's been logging, as we talked about once again. So Easter Island. We talked a little bit about Easter Island. We talked about the fact that the natives that lived on that island, which is a couple thousand miles off the coast of Chile, they used their population, human population grew too fast, causing there to be an over expenditure of resources. Super common on island type systems. Remember, island is sometimes called island biogeography or island geography. The idea behind that is that you have these events that take place. In this case, huge population growth, probably because there was at the time plenty of food. There are very few limiting resources. Um, Ironically, humans are one of the few things that don't live to carrying capacity. We kind of live beyond it, but that's a kind of a conversation for another slide. And once again, resources we use, there are somewhere in the neighborhood of 10,000 people or so at one point on the island, which dwindled down to in the low hundreds. So just a crazy thing that can actually happen. So starting with some of the slides that you guys worked on, did a great job. So obviously, these are the levels of complexity when you're talking about how interaction happens between organisms. So obviously, the individual lives in a population of similar organisms, so of the same species. Community would be interaction among species. So here you're seeing obviously the rabbits and the wolf. Wolf's kind of probably looking at his chops there. Ecosystem and energy flow. So how resources are used. This kind of goes back to the topic of like carbon cycle, nitrogen cycle, water cycle, so on and so forth, phosphorus cycle. This is what takes place in the ecosystem, and there's this matter or energy that flows from one organism to another, all driven by the sun. And obviously, we can kind of look at it on a global scale. Interestingly enough, though, these are the lower scales here. Population, individual, really, but populations. We can figure out a lot what's going on in the world based on how individual populations are are doing, whether they're thriving or not thriving. So this is kind of where the study starts, usually at the population level. So once again, this is some vocabulary for this here. Things like these kind of make sense. Population size, obviously, total number of organisms. Density, how many people, how many organisms in a given area. Cities tend to have way more density than the outside world. This is a quick little link here to National Geographic's Wicked Tuna, which evidently Disney's come up with a new streaming service. I guess I'm not going to get a chance to watch that one with you. So go back to that. So anyway, what the Wicked Tuna thing has to do with is the fact that Wicked Tuna, they go out and they catch giant bluefin tuna. And what's happened is over the course of the last, I don't know, 30 or maybe 50 years or so, bluefin tuna fishing really became popular in the 1960s. Ernest Hemingway, who was an author that some of you might have read, he was really big into fishing and sport fishing for like sailfish, marlin, swordfish, and tuna. And a lot of those fish back in the day were caught not necessarily for a food source, but caught as like as prizes or as trophies. And you want to catch the biggest fish. And the idea, unfortunately, what happened is that as you catch some of these larger fish, those fish are large because they have genes that allow them to be large, and obviously they need food, the food source, and the space, and those kind of things. But you can eat as much as you want. You can have plenty of space if you want. If you don't have the genes to grow large, you're not going to grow large. When you think of humans. So when you catch those larger organisms, what happens is then you take that largeness gene out of the population, which has kind of made the tuna now a little smaller. I mean, they're still enormous, but the average giant tuna runs between 73 inches and about 105 inches, as opposed to somewhere in the mid 120s or almost 130 inches back in the day. So I'm not sure which group did this, but you did a great job once again with the idea of how populations or how organisms can be grouped. They can be random, which is what we see usually in trees. They can be uniform. In this picture here, they want to be kind of equal distance apart because they have a nest. These are probably a bird called the masked booby, and these birds build these nests on these kind of rough shores here, and they build their nest just far enough apart so they're out of pecking distance, if you will. So they each bird has its own area to raise its young and rear its young. Clump distribution is a good example of some groundhogs or some type of a ferret animal. They work in these clumped groupings like this for protection. You see it a lot with fish that school, that travel as massive packs, if you will. So this is something that's going to come up too throughout the course of this chapter, and you'll see it on the AP exam. Density-dependent versus density-independent factors. I use the example of getting into nursing school with you guys. If there's only 100 spots and there's 2,000 people that apply, your odds of getting in are tougher because there's so many people or so many applicants for a limited number of spots. It's density dependent. Now, if you were applying for general entrance to a school and they only had 1,000 openings and 2,000 kids applied, you have a way better chance of getting in. Why? Because there's a smaller group applying for that same entry. So density-dependent factors are directly related to the number of individuals in a population. The more organisms, if there's enough food for 20 and there's 100, those other 80 are going to be in rough shape. Actually, the whole 100 would be in rough shape because they're going to compete for that food, and each individual is going to be worse off for it. All right. Density-independent factors. These are factors that have no bearing on or no importance on the number of organisms in a group. For example, think of like natural disasters or weather-related events. For example, let's say you have a herd of bison, buffalo, and they're grazing across the plains, and you go through a stretch of 3, 4, 5 weeks where there's no rain. That's a density independent factor. The fact that there's no rain is going to affect the bison, whether there were 10 bison or 2,000 bison. If there was plenty of food, 2,000 obviously bison versus 20 bison, there would be a density dependent factor there with the sheer numbers. But if there's no rain and there's no food source because there's no photosynthesis, it doesn't matter if you have 20 or 200. It's a density independent factor. Growth rate. Growth rate is just it's births minus deaths. Really simple. So if in the U.S. population currently, we're probably about our growth rate's about 0.5%, meaning that let's say for every how can I come up with a number there? For every 99 people that die, 100 people are born. All right, so that would be 1%. So if we were at 0.5% for every 200 people that are born, there are 199 people dying. So we're increasing our growth rate at a very small number. And there's a number of things that drive that. It's we talk about human population. We'll talk about that kind of probably next week. It could be things like education. Let's face it, women who are educated tend to wait longer to have kids. You can see, I think of some of my former students, that are now having children, and most of them wait till they're in their late 20s. Why? You go to high school, you go to college, you try to establish yourself in a career, and so you're willing to push when you have kids off to a later time. And when you tend to do that, you tend to have less children in general. Whereas in other countries that are less developed, there might not be the same education level for women, which then obviously affects how many kids you have. If there's less education, you're probably starting younger, having more children. Intrinsic growth rate is just it's how well you can grow, if you're given all the things that you need. So, for example, in the case of humans, it takes 9.5, 10 months to have a child, to reproduce. And if you want to talk about, generationally, you might have 2 to 3 kids in one particular generation, of pairings, if you will. Whereas, and that's, giving, let's say, plenty of money and plenty of food and time and all those kind of things, you would probably tend to have more children. The reality is that people work, kids are expensive, so we don't really maybe meet our intrinsic growth rate for humans. In the case of bacteria have intrinsic growth rate as well. I think one of the groups the other day brought up the fact that about every 20 minutes to an hour they can reproduce, depending on the bacteria. That would be its intrinsic growth rate. So J-shaped curve, this is an exponential growth. This is what would happen over time to a population of organisms if, and don't worry about the equation, it's really not something we need to deal with. This would happen if if everything was perfect and you grew to your intrinsic growth rate, you would continue to grow exponentially. And this line would go up and up and up and up, and the slope would get steeper and steeper and steeper. This really can't happen. This is more what happens. So you can have an exponential growth. Things are great, environment's perfect, there's plenty of open space for organisms, there's plenty of food, and then all of a sudden they get to this point where they start to compete. And during this competition phase, the growth rate starts to slow, the growth and death rate kind of become equal, and eventually you have no growth. Why? You've reached what's called your carrying capacity. You can't have any more organisms because you're missing some of the key factors: space, food, disease gets in the way, competition. All of these things cause pretty much all life on Earth to eventually reach its carrying capacity. Okay, and we get this kind of S-shaped curves. This type of growth is called logistic when it gets close to your carrying capacity, meaning it's logical for the growth to stay within that area. So if you were to zoom in, so let me go back one. If you were to zoom in here and kind of zoom in on the carrying capacity line, it doesn't stay flatlined. What actually happens is you get to your carrying capacity. Let's call it, I like to use the example of deer. Let's say the carrying capacity for deer is in Massachusetts is roughly 10 to 11 deer per square mile. So in the case of East Bridgewater, 17 square miles, there should be 170 deer in East Bridgewater. Well, there's way more than that. Why? Overshoot. All right, so there's probably, if I had to guess, somewhere in this part of the state, I think it's between 25 and 35 deer per square mile. This is what they call Zone 11. So there's somewhere in the neighborhood in a place like East Bridgewater, there could be as many as 600 or 700 deer in the town of East Bridgewater, which I could be over-exaggerating a little bit, but let's call it 500 as opposed to the 170 or so that should be here. They've overshot. Why? Because there were plenty of resources available and they were still breeding at the same rate. Well, at some point what's going to happen is there's going to be a die-off. This die-off can come through a number of different ways. It can come through disease, automobile strikes. All right, if there's more deer, they have to cross more roads, which causes is risky for them. Hunting season comes. All right, the cold weather comes. All these things can then cause die-off. All right. When you then get below the carrying capacity, the organisms that are left, there's more space, there's more food, they're not worried about crossing roads as much, maybe hunting season is over, maybe the weather starts to turn, and then they start to go back up. And eventually there's this zigzag effect where there's too many, they die off. There's too many, they die off. All right. If you were talking about, let's say these are rabbits, and you were talking about the orange line being rabbits. If I were to draw a line right behind it with coyotes, which would be predators for rabbits, they would increase shortly after the peak for the rabbits, let's say is orange, the peak for the coyotes would be somewhere right here. They would peak, and as they peak, what happens is there's a decline in their prey. After the prey declines, then shortly after, you'd have a decline in the predator. And so the predators and prey have this kind of unique relationship where the predator is always a little behind. If you look at their population size, is always a little behind the prey, which makes sense. K&R selected, you're definitely going to see this on the AP exam. So K-selected humans, all right, we pretty much all mammals are K-selected. So if you get stuck on a test somewhere and they ask you about K versus R selected, you think about animals that are mammals. They're almost always case selected. I can't think of many that aren't case selected, and it's because we grow slow, have to take care of our young. Hence, mammals producing milk, those kind of things. Our selected species always think of things that are being eaten by others. So if you're eaten by others, if you're let's see, if you're prey, you could be. I think it was Alexis brought up the fact that lettuce is prey for rabbits. All right, which is definitely totally true. They're instead of carnivores, they're herbivores, and they have that kind of relationship where there's an herbivore predator and a herb prey. All right, if you have to grow really fast and there's lots of you, you are selected. Okay, these often do. Once again, they'll have massive explosion of population and then this huge die-off. Dandelions is a great example. So if you have dandelions in your yard, there's a certain point where there's none, and all of a sudden they grow like crazy, and they use up all the energy of the fuel they have, and then they die right off. All right. So here's some other examples of what R and K would have. All right. I think you can kind of see where animals like mammals would fit into this particularly. For example, mammals have a long life for the most part. Take a long time to reach maturity. Good, quarter to 20% of their life. Very few offspring. Reproductive events. I mean, if in the course of a lifetime, you might only have 3 or 4 offspring. Sometimes only one. Sometimes none. All right. Size of the offspring. Offspring tend to be a little larger and are able to kind of fend for themselves in some respects. There are some examples where that doesn't fit. For example, if you talk about like marsupials, they give birth to really tiny little babies that are kind of like not quite ready to go, and they're born and then crawl into the mother's pouch, and they finish growing there, kind of like they're marsupials. So you see kangaroos and possums and things like that. Parental care is present, meaning you have to take care of them. Population growth is relatively slow. This is why we have to be careful with organisms like large mammals, large carnivores that are slowly dying off. They reproduce at such a slow rate in the wild that any loss of any of them, we think of whales, dolphins, large cats, elephants. These they grow so slow, or they reproduce so infrequently that you need to any that die off really have a huge impact on the population. And the population regulation obviously is density dependent. You can only have so many in a particular area before they become these kind of issues with looking and going after food. Okay, so survivorship curves. These came up the other day. So let's look at the 3. So type 1 are like case-selected organisms for the most part, always. They live a long life. They survive pretty well because they're taken care of by their parents. And then there's the die-off happens relatively slow. Okay, so here in this case, very few organisms die young. Okay, where the opposite is the case, if we look at type 3, are selected, make a ton of offspring, hoping that some survive. All right, notice that the survivors here are very low. All right, and then there's a massive die-off. Then there are other organisms that are totally right in the middle. These guys. It's like a 50-50 chance, in the case of we'll use humans or whales, you'd almost never hear of any infants dying. It's because we have good prenatal care, good postnatal care, and people relatively take care of their offspring. Dandelions is the case, once again, massive die-offs because they are selected. Squirrels are kind of in that strange area here. So they're mammals, so you would think they're case selected, but they do give birth to many, many young. And they're also, because they're smaller body size, they don't need as much food, let's say, or as much nurturing as larger offspring would need. They have like a 50-50 survivorship. All right, so this is kind of in between the K and the R are the squirrels. Metapopulations. We're going to watch a quick video on this today in class. It has to do with the mountain lions of LA, and you get to see that. But metapopulations are basically, you think of these mountain ranges here, and the mountain ranges are connected by corridors to allow that allow organisms to go from one place to another. So these metapopulations at sometimes get cut off. So as humans, we might develop roads in these areas, in these valleys, which then does not allow organisms to travel from one place to another, causing the organisms in this one area, let's say, to then be genetically less diverse because they're not able to move from here to here. Let's see, competition. I'm going to kind of skip this one here. Okay. Resource partitioning has to do with competition. So, for example, in this case, we have two species, right? One's a strong competitor, one's a weak competitor, and they show seed size, and they talk about how looks like species 2 likes big seeds, species 1 likes small seeds, but because species 1 is a better competitor, it can eat those medium-sized seeds, and this overlap is then going to go away. So what happens is this species 1 takes over more of the habitat, a lot pushing species 2 away from these medium-sized seeds. And part of that is because obviously species 1 is probably better at using them in some way. All right. If there were, and it comes to this idea that no two species can occupy the same location or niche. All right. This is why we get this spread. Okay. Cool. Types of predation. I know these are going to be talked about in class. Obviously, predators you should know. Parasites you should know. Herbivores, predation generally you should know. Parasitoids. These are kind of gross. These are things that lay eggs inside other organisms. Remind me to tell you. Hopefully in class you'll watch this at some point on your own. Ask me about chiggers. Chiggers. Chiggers are disgusting little animals, and I'll be more than happy to tell you my story behind those. So mutualism, mutualistic relationships, both things benefit. Super simple. Commensalism is a type of symbiotic relationship where one gets something and the other one is not negatively affected, and obviously it's not helped either. So I think of your dog, for example. You have a commensalistic relationship with a dog. You're eating a piece of steak, the steak falls on the floor. You're not going to go pick the steak up because you don't believe in the 5-second rule. So the dog comes by and eats the steak. That's a commensalistic relationship. The dog benefited, and you were not hurt in any way by not eating that one piece of steak. Keystone species. Keystone species are usually a very important organism in the scheme of things, but they may not be large in numbers. So the populations might be small. So even though they don't have a lot of organisms, they still might have a role in the community that creates habitats or food sources for others. Beavers are a great example of this, where they make these beaver dams, and they make these beaver dams for obviously for their own purposes. And as a result, you get these structures that then create pools, which could be good for fish and insects and amphibians and you name it. There are a number of organisms that benefit from this. You take away the beaver dam, and all those benefits that those organisms have are now gone. Succession, there's two types, there's primary and secondary. Primary succession only occurs one time. Primary succession is when new land or rock is exposed, and you get this gradual growth of structures. We go from exposed rock to mosses, weeds, perennial weeds, shrubs. We get small, usually pine-style trees, until we get what's called a broadleaf or deciduous forest. This can only happen once because new land can only be exposed once. This would happen in places where there's an upwelling of land, maybe at continental plates. It can happen around volcanoes where ocean volcanoes create these islands that then can be habited. Secondary succession, notice that there's no rocks. Okay, this can happen many, many, many times. We had this happen here, secondary succession in New England, going back to that first picture of the chapter. So what happened is when the Pilgrims came, this is what they saw. They saw birch and maple trees. They cut these trees down, one to produce shelter, firewood, you name it, the reasons they cut them down. Cut them down to then create tools that they need or types of transportation. And then what happened is they used the land for farming. When they stopped farming, here's what happened. Succession took place. Weeds came in, perennial weeds and grasses, like the goldenrod was one of them. Then you get smaller shrubs that start to take over, and then eventually these trees take over, back all the way to the broadleaf forest that we see today. Aquatic succession, this happens in water as well. You can have open water, and over time, the land creeps in, whether it be from leaf litter falling in, whether it be from water drying up, but eventually these basins fill in. Believe it or not, this happened here. If you were to go to where the principal's office is, the principal's office is actually from there under the library, and then it kind of takes a right-hand turn and goes under the auditorium, especially down in the pit area down below. That used to be a river, and through the process of aquatic succession, that river filled in over the course of time. How do they know it was a river? When they started digging the hole to put the foundation in there, this is what they saw. They could tell by the type of material they were digging through that used to be some type of river or stream. All right, I'm going to kind of stop here, and we'll pick up next time.